Welcome to True Believers and the Road to Hell. Today we're joined by Dan Crone, who's a prominent attorney here in New Mexico. It was February of 1980 that there was a shock, a jolt to the system of New Mexico when we had the New Mexico prison riot, and people who were around at that time and remember those times remember how ugly it was, how devastating it was, how fascinating it was, and it was a really emotional and turbulent time, a shock to the penitentiary system as well as the court system, and to a lot of individuals. And of course, uh, 33 prisoners were killed at that time, and it was one of the worst prison outbreaks in United States history. That brings me to Dan because Dan has had a special role with respect to that riot and the things that happened after the riot, and we're going to ask him about it. But Dan, back in 1980, how old were you?
Well, let's see. I was at the time of the riot 28 years old.
So tell us about your special role or how you got involved with uh, riot related issues.
Well, at the time I was in law school, and a law professor of mine had been appointed as a special master on a prison conditions case involving the Georgia State Prison. That prison at the time had the reputation for being the most violent prison in the South. And ironically, on February 2nd, which is when the riot broke out here in Santa Fe, um, I was on my way back from a trip to the prison in Georgia and had a very harrowing plane ride back, filled with storms and delays. And so I'd basically been up all night, and I got back home in Toledo, excuse me, which is where I was living at the time. And so I got there like about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I remember turning on the TV and seeing the first images of what was going on. And the thought went through my head at the time, boy, I'm sure glad I don't have anything to do with that place.
Right.
Little did
Yeah.
I know. So what ended up happening then is that I graduated from law school in, I guess it would have been May of 1980. And um, by that time, the Duran case, which was the prison conditions case here in Santa Fe, um, had been working its way through a number of orders relating to the um, conditions there, and they
That was
needed.
all, just to clarify, that was all pre-riot, the
No, not
Duran.
all of it. Well, the
But
case
some
was
of
filed.
the
The
case
case
was
was
filed
filed
pre-riot.
pre-riot,
Right.
but there was only a tiny fraction of the court orders that ended up happening. There was only a tiny fraction of those in place, and so what happened is, as a result of the riot, the two parties hammered out agreements on a variety of areas of prison life, really, which encompassed every possible thing from staffing to overcrowding, medical care, food service, really everything. And so they needed somebody to monitor the order. And so they had heard about the work that I had done in Georgia because at the time there were several prison cases, conditions cases going on. This was before the Supreme Court basically gutted the prison conditions rights. And so there were only about five of us in the country at the time who were doing that kind of work. So they heard about the work that I had done in Georgia, and they called me and asked if I would come for
Who's
an interview.
who's
Uh,
they? Who's they,
uh,
Dan?
they being the corrections department. And so I said yes. I would come for an interview, and then I got a map out to try and figure out where in the world Santa Fe, New Mexico was,
Yeah.
because I had only once been west of the Mississippi. And so, to make a long story short, I came out, I was interviewed, and I was hired for the job. There,
What exactly was the job?
well, the job title was compliance monitor, and what the parties wanted. When I say the parties, the corrections department was uh, represented by the New Mexico Attorney General's office, and it was Jeff Bingaman, who was the AG at the time. And the National Prison Project, with Ralph Knowles as their lead counsel, and then local counsel was Friedman, Boyd, and Daniels. And so um, what they had requested of the judge, who was Jimmy Campos, Santiago Campos, was they wanted a special master because the advantage to a special master is that the special master was an agent of the court and so responded to the court. Judge Campos, and this is something that always had amazed me. Judge Campos had little to no interest in the case, even after the riot happened. And he refused to appoint me as a special master. So the parties tried to structure the job as close to that of a special master, but the basic flaw in it was that I was hired by a contract from the corrections department, and it was intended that I be completely independent. But as I'm sure we'll get into later on in the conversation, once they saw my reports, they
They didn't
they
think you were independent.
right, that's
Yeah.
right.
Right.
So, so that's how I became involved with the case.
So what was I mean, obviously the riot had a huge impact on that, but maybe I shouldn't make that assumption. Go ahead, you tell me.
So, what's your question?
Well, in terms of the effect of I mean, how the riot and the aftermath of the riot, how that fits into your work.
Oh, okay. So, um, what my job was to submit reports uh, as to the compliance of the corrections department to, or with, I should say, the federal court orders. And so, what I did was I spent, oh gosh, I probably, before everything was said and done, spent a couple of thousand hours actually inside the walls of the prison. And I went about the business of trying to determine what the compliance was with the court orders. Now, so the first thing that I did was the way that the orders were drafted and constructed. Um, it didn't lend itself to easily report on individual parts of it. And so what I did was I took the order and broke it down into a series of single issues, for compliance. And then I had three categories. One was compliance, another was non-compliance, and then the other was no finding, because there are certain things that I was not able to make a finding on because I didn't have enough information. And so what I did was, well, the first thing I did once I got to the prison was to establish a couple of inmate committees because I obviously couldn't, deal with everybody. And so there was one representative from each housing unit, except for cell block 3. Cell block 3 was the maximum security cell block. And I think I had about six, maybe, members of cell block 3 who were on that committee. And those committees I met with separately.
So
So
when
I,
is the, excuse me, Dan, but I'm curious about you got this call as I'm understanding it, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you got this call asking for your services or inquiring about your services just soon after the riot, am I right?
yes.
So when is the first time that you actually came here? Yeah.
Well, let's see. I think the first time I actually came was in about maybe September.
Okay.
Um,
So then, when you say you went inside the walls, I was wondering how fresh the riot aftermath was when you went there. I mean, obviously, it had changed pretty dramatically in the 6 or 7 months that before you got there, but it was still a war zone, essentially.
it was. When I got there, in terms of the physical plant, the walls were still black from the soot from the fires, and you could still smell that. There were some dormitories that were condemned, and so they at that time were left in the same condition as when the riot ended. Um, there was some construction going on, but the physical plant was still in utter disrepair.
Well, and also I'm sure it affected your job. Also, you're talking about the inmate committees. A lot of people had been transferred out of the penitentiary or out of Santa Fe,
Mhm.
and so I'm sure that must have caused you some difficulty as well in trying to. I don't know that. I'm assuming that you wanted to have communication with a lot of people who weren't even there anymore.
That really didn't end up being a problem for me. Um, and what I the one of the first things, well, let me just tell you a little bit first about the arrangement that I had with them. So the arrangement that I had was that I had a prison pass that I wore, just like any staff member there. And the arrangement was that I could go anywhere I wanted to at any time of the night or day, and that I would be unaccompanied by any prison staff. Now, that was for a few reasons. One is that, it would have stymied
Intimidating, sure.
communication,
Yeah.
that I would have had. But the other thing is, it would have cut into my legitimacy in the eyes of the prisoners, because they would have viewed me as being, basically a tool of the staff. Um, on my very first visit there, there was a confrontation that happened that ended up legitimizing me in the eyes of the prisoners. Um, the first day that I went there, the first thing I did was to go introduce myself. So I went to all the housing units, told them who I was and what my purpose was, and I told them that I was not an ombudsman, and that I wasn't there to handle individual complaints, except to the extent that it was something that fit under one of the categories of the court order. So I started at the dormitory end of the prison and worked my way then towards the other end. And the last unit I went into was cell block 3. Now, cell block 3 was the cell block. It was the maximum security cell block. And while you are correct that there were a number of prisoners that were shipped out of state because of the overcrowding, um, among those that were transferred were not the people from cell block 3, because at that time it included all of the prisoners who were charged with prison crimes. And so they were all there. Um, so I went into cell block 3, and I didn't really know it at the time, but I found out shortly after. The staff was so frightened by the prisoners who were in cell block 3 that no staff member would go in unless everybody was in their cell and the doors were locked. They were afraid to have any contact whatsoever. So when I went to cell block 3, everybody was out milling around, in the cell block. They saw me come in, and so um, I said, okay, let me in. And he said, oh, no, no, we can't do that. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, nobody goes in there unless everyone is in their cells. And I said, okay, I have this pass. I'm permitted to go anywhere in the prison at any time. And I want to go in there, and I want to go in there now. By this time, all of the prisoners who are out are watching this confrontation to see who's going to win. And they said, no, we can't let you in. And I said, call the warden. So they called the warden, and the warden said, let him in. So I went in and, just treated it like I was at a Kiwanis Club meeting. I was shaking hands and introducing myself, and, telling them I'm going to need a committee from the cell block here. I don't care how you choose it. Um, but I'll be back in a couple of days to find out, and we'll get things going. That confrontation then ended up legitimizing me because they saw that I was neither afraid of them, the prisoners, nor the staff, and
Right.
so that was how things got started.
Well, I can attest that cell block three was notorious, of course. It was the center of a case that we tried, a riot case that we tried back in the day. And so I guess, were you aware of the reputation of cell block three at the time you had that confrontation? I'm wondering if maybe if you knew everything about cell block three, you might have thought twice about it. But no, I understand. It makes perfect sense that you having that conversation in front of those inmates was very helpful to you.
Well, it was, and the way that I knew that they thought that I was legit is that, and this was something that I had learned working the Georgia prison case, is that if you were viewed as being legitimate, then the leaders, the hardest guys wanted to be on the committee because they viewed that as, a source of having some power. And so the list of who was on my cell block three committee was a list of everybody who was charged with the worst murder crimes,
Right, right.
and I actually got to know all those folks real well.
Hmm. That's interesting. So let's. I'm wondering, when you hear about the riot, we get this call, and you're going to get these services. Did it ever give you? Was the riot kind of a source of invigoration to you? Okay, yeah, it really makes me want to do this job. Or did it give you pause to say, I don't know, doing this compliance thing in these circumstances is really difficult.
Um, I had no compunction about or second thoughts about doing it. I was young, ready to go, and I went.
Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Yeah.
That was it. That was
Yeah.
it.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So you were 28 at the time you did that. What was your start that got you into this? You don't really look like a prison guy to me, for better or worse. No offense, but how did you tell us a little bit about your background that got you to be a lawyer in the first place?
Well, so let's see. I was so I had actually wanted to be a lawyer ever since I was in like the eighth grade.
Really?
And I grew up on a farm and in a very small community. And when I
In
went to
Ohio, is that right?
yes, yes, uh, uh, I grew up on a farm outside of a little town called Salina, Ohio, which bordered. It was 10 miles from the Indiana border. And so when I went to college, it was a great shock to me. And I struggled academically for a couple of years. But then I got my footing and did well with my grades. But when uh, when I applied for law school, at that time, let's see, I'm trying to think if the Vietnam War had ended. I'm not sure. But in any event, it was very competitive to get into law school.
Where
And
did you go to law
so
school?
went to law school in Toledo.
Hmm.
And so when I applied, I uh, was initially turned down. And so, in the instructions that you get and everything else, they said they don't do personal interviews and, we don't do that sort of thing. So I immediately knew that that was exactly what I needed to do. And I put my suit on and drove to Toledo and presented myself at the Dean of Admissions office to the law school. And the secretary, I identified myself to the secretary, and she wanted to know what I wanted. And I said, well, I'd like to talk about my application. And the dean had his door open, and he was in there. So I knew he was there. So they took my file in, and he looked at it, and he said, well, he said, you know, the reason why we turned you down is because there's just so many people applying. It's not that we don't think, that you could do the work or, be a lawyer. It's just that we don't have enough room. And so I said, well, let me make sure I got this straight. So you're saying that you think that, I'm qualified to do it, but you just don't have the room. Is that right? And he said, yes. And I said, okay. I said, I'll tell you what, you let me in and I won't take anybody's seat. I'll stand in the back of the room during classes if you let me in. And that then led to me being put on the waiting list. And then I bought what was the state of the art at the time, which was an answering machine. Of course, there were no such things as cell phones then. And I got home from work one day, and it was about 5 days before school was supposed to start. And they said, a spot's opened up. Are you still interested? So I immediately quit my job. I had a nice car at the time. I sold it and got a $600 car that would run so that I would have money for tuition and, to pay for an apartment. And I loaded up what few possessions I had and went to law school.
You
So
didn't have to stand in the back of the room, I guess.
I did not.
Yeah.
I was admitted to the night program, which was good because I didn't have the money. And so I worked during the day.
What were you
And
doing? What were you working at?
well, for the first term, I worked at a an electrical warehouse. But a cousin of mine was a prosecutor in Toledo, and an opening came up to clerk for a judge. There, they had law students who would clerk for judges. He put in a good word for me, and I got hired. So I was in a courtroom every day for 2 years. And during the course of that, I met a number of lawyers, and one of them recommended me to Vince Nathan, who was a law professor, and Vince was the person who was the special master in a couple of cases in Ohio. And the law student he had working for him had just graduated and he needed somebody. So basically, I got hooked up and I had always been interested. I had read a lot about the abuses that had gone on in prisons around the country. And I thought it was an opportunity to do something about that, to try to make things right. And so I quit the clerking job, which everybody thought I was crazy because I took a pay cut to do it. And I started working then with Vince. And shortly after that, he was appointed as special master on the Georgia case. And so that's what got my foot in the door in Georgia, which then led to me coming here.
Wow. That's quite a quite a train of events. But but it all started when did you say when you were 8 years old? Is that what you said? You wanted to be a lawyer since you were 8 years old?
Eighth grade, yeah,
Eighth grade. Okay, eighth
yeah.
grade. So why was it in the eighth grade you wanted to be a lawyer? Watch a TV show or Perry Mason or something, or what was going on there?
Well, um, I um, I had a tremendous interest uh, and read the paper. There was a lot going on at that time, and that was when the Freedom Riders um, were trying to register Black folks to vote in Mississippi and across the South. And I saw what was going on with the abuses that were going on with that. Um, and there was a particular case that I followed really closely and identified with, and it was the Sam Shepard case. He was a doctor in Cleveland, and and since it was in Ohio, it was in all the papers. He had been convicted of murdering his wife, but I had been reading all these newspaper accounts, and I was convinced that he was innocent. His case ended up going to the Supreme Court, and it got reversed because both the prosecutor well, there was going to be an election in 3 weeks, and the prosecutor was running for judge, and the sitting judge was running for re-election. And the Supreme Court described the atmosphere as a Roman holiday. So he got a new trial,
F.
and
Lee
then
Bailey stepped in at that point, didn't he?
he
Wasn't
did.
it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the cases that catapulted him to national prominence. And
Mm.
so I followed all that very closely, and then I saw how the courts were able to um, um, address the abuses that were going on, with Black folks. And I recognized that it was a way to right wrongs. And I wanted to do that. I wanted, I identified with people who were wrongly accused. And I identified, with, sort of in a moral sense of some of the things that were going on. And I saw that the law was a way to right those wrongs. And so that's what you know fueled my passion.
And it sounds like you even, and then your passion was targeted to this prison work.
And criminal defense, yes.
So let's get back to that then in terms of, uh, well, I'll ask a maybe unanswerable question, but in terms of how do you compare that experience that you started with, and you were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and very enthusiastic and idealistic, sounds like, wanting to right the wrongs of the world. How do you compare that with today?
Well, in terms of what I've seen at the prisons, first of all, it is no place that anyone would ever want to go to by choice. But there has been tremendous improvement, here in New Mexico. Still far from perfect, but there has been tremendous improvement from when I first came here. Um, um, the One of the things, and this might be a place to talk about some of the aftershocks
Sure.
from the riot, which I saw when I came.
Well, Dan, just for those, if anybody's listening who and they're not as familiar as you are, we are on some of these issues. Why don't you give us a 30-second description of what we're talking about in terms of it's hard to do in 30 seconds, but you know what I mean in terms of the just the horrendous nature of what the riot was about, what the damage and injury and was.
Well, you uh, had mentioned that 33 prisoners died. There was Attica. There were more prisoners that were killed in Attica, but the difference is that all of those prisoners died during the takeover and died at the hands of the troops that took the prison over. In New Mexico, all 33 deaths were at the hands of other prisoners. And so what that did then was to there in terms of what led to the riot. First, if there was one word to describe what led to the riot, it was neglect. The prison was out of sight, out of mind, and there was no scrutiny that was going on at the time. It was tremendously understaffed, and they operated on the snitch system. So what the guards would do would be to get prisoners to basically tell on each other, and then the guards would act upon what they were told. And then the people who had given the information were deemed to be snitches. And of course, if you look at the hierarchy of the clientele in a prison, the snitches are at the bottom,
Right.
and so the snitches were all housed in cell block 4 here in Santa Fe, and so the food service was terrible, the medical care was terrible, and basically it just all boiled over, on February 2nd, and that's what led up to it. The staff itself was undertrained. I mean, by the time I came here, for one reason or another, I'd probably been in 30 or 40 prisons around the country for one reason or another. And hands down, um, um, the the competency of the staff here was the worst of any place that I had been to, and they were just undertrained. They were overwhelmed, and those are all things that contributed to the riot.
And these are also things that you, I'm sure, alluded to in your report
Yes,
that was not received favorably by some people.
right, right. Yeah, and so I don't know if now is a good time to talk about my report, but
Go ahead. Go ahead,
okay.
sure.
So, um, so I was, like I say, I was in my 20s, and at a time, I had a baby face,
You still
and
do, Dan, by the way.
thank you.
You look
You
like you're
know, I mean,
28
I got
today.
carded at a time when they didn't card people, well into my 30s, and so, I had this baby face, and my demeanor is, I'm not combative, and so they mistook, my pleasant nature for weakness, and my appearance. And so I think that they thought that I would write some 20-page report and they'd be rid of me. Well, my first report was 350 pages long. It was not complimentary of the operation. And what I did, the way that I gathered my information to make the report was through a variety of means. One was to gather information from the prisoners from my inmate committees. And then I also talked to staff members. I also reviewed all kinds of records. And one of the things that I learned early on, before I ever got here, is that it was a huge mistake to make a negative finding based solely on the word of the prisoners.
Right.
And so I sought other ways to try to show what was apparent to me as noncompliance. And I can give you one example. And this was something that really pissed off the corrections department because they thought it was dirty pool. So there was a section in the court order that related to legal mail. And what the court order did was it created certain categories of people who would send mail in to prisoners that was considered to be confidential. And so, in order to open any of that mail, there had to be some sort of legal cause for them to open the mail. So, um, I kept the prisoners kept telling me that every letter that came to them, regardless of who it came from, was opened. And what the prison had was I don't know exactly what you called it. I called it a letter slicer, but it would slice off, a little bit of the top of an envelope, and then they could look at the mail, and when the prisoners received it, um, it would um, it would be open. And so the among these categories of what was considered to be privileged communication, it was like, legislators, ministers, lawyers, um, and one of them was the media. So when I was in Toledo working in the court system there, I'd gotten to know some of the local reporters. And the newspaper there was the Toledo Blade, and the Blade in their envelopes had proclaimed themselves as being one of America's great newspapers. So it was apparent, from the envelope that it was coming from a newspaper. So I called up one of the reporters I knew and asked him if they'd send me a bunch of empty envelopes, and he did. So I then put a letter together that I sent out to each of my inmate representatives. And I basically said, dear so and so, as you know, section blah, blah, blah of the court order has certain forms of privileged communication. I'm sending this letter to you in an envelope that's clearly marked as being from a newspaper. When you receive this letter, hang on to it, and I'll collect it, next week when we have our meeting. So I went, and of course, every single one of them had been opened, and it was all the same. It was like with a razor blade.
Right.
And so that was the proof I had that they weren't
Department.
that they weren't complying with that part of the court order, and they were really steamed about that after the report came out. But those were some of the things that I did and came up with,
Well,
in
let me ask about that. I mean, okay, they're really steamed, but they're really steamed because they got caught, you mean?
yeah.
Not they didn't have any like rationale, or did they? That was there a rationale for things in I want to ask you about that specifically. And generally speaking, you were mentioned the non credibility of singly an inmate. But was there argument against your report that well you're cheating by doing being sneaky, and also everything's relying on people who are not credible to begin with?
Well, uh, first of all, I never made a negative finding based solely on the word of a prisoner. And the second thing that they were really steamed about was, and frankly, I never understood any of this, um, in terms of their reaction. But I would go around and talk to staff members who were involved, in whatever the particular area was. And, I would take notes. And then when I wrote the report, the things that the prisoners had told me that then, staff members confirmed, um, I used that, basically the what the staff said, or if there was documentation, from because the prison had all kinds of forms and other things. And I would base negative findings on um, um, those things, what staff had told me and what the records would show, uh, in addition to what the prisoners had told me. So after and so they never once challenged any one of my negative findings as being untrue. All they could say, and all they said to the press, was that it was unbalanced. And so what I did was, and this
Unbalanced because what?
because I made all these negative findings, and the findings of compliance by comparison were, you know,
Not very many.
not very
No.
many,
Right.
few and far between.
So if they
So,
got this, well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, so what I did was, and this whole scenario is an interesting story. So what I did was, I did a draft of the report, and I sent the draft to both parties. And I told them that, this was an opportunity for them if they thought I had anything wrong to tell me, and that I would change it before I submitted it to the court. So when I went to meet with the people from the corrections department, I keep in mind that it was just me, I didn't have some huge staff. I had a secretary who did the typing, and that was it. So they wanted to have a meeting with me to talk about the report, and I said, okay, fine. So they held the meeting over in the Baton Building, uh, which originally, before the Roundhouse was built, was where the legislature met. And there was a room in there that had this long table that probably sat 30 people. So I walk in there, and there are 30 people sitting around, all from the corrections department, and all of them staring at me. Uh, and so I sat
This is
down.
like going into cell block three, right? Yeah,
Right, that's worse.
worse than that. Yeah,
They like me there.
yeah, right.
Um, Anyhow, I go in, and the only complaints that they had was, well, first of all, they cited the one I told you about, the legal mail. Okay. I mean, they were really steamed about that. But the other thing that they were really steamed about was it was as though somehow with these interviews that I did with their own staff members, and when their staff members told me things, and then
You, you
included
relied
what
on them, yeah.
yeah, when I included that in my report, um, it was like I betrayed some kind of a norm by outing the staff members. They never, not with one single negative finding that I made, they never made any substantive challenge to it because I had them cold, on all of them. So meanwhile, what happened was I had, like I say, sent it to the parties, and I don't know who, but I have a good idea who gave a copy of my draft report to the Albuquerque Journal. And so on the day, I remember it was a Friday in May, and I of 1981. And so I went to the courthouse and submitted the report. Uh, and by coincidence, my it was the first time that my parents were going to come out and visit me, and then I drove to the airport to go pick them up. So Saturday morning rolls around, and I picked up the Albuquerque Journal from my doorstep, and they had been given a copy of the draft report, and so there was like two full pages, or maybe more. It's been decades since I've looked at a copy of it, but um, and they detailed all, 2 or 3 pages worth of newsprint to all the details that I had in the report, and they created this graph, and the graph was with guard towers, and so there was a guard tower for non-compliance, on the graph, and then another one for compliance, and then another one for no findings, and that was on the front page. And so, that then, really caused that coverage really caused an explosion, of reaction by the public and the papers. And so the
So
corrections part, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask you if that resulted in you getting stonewalled by
Well, it
the
was a little more than that.
or to get
Since I
fired or
was
what? But
Yeah, yeah. Since I was, technically under contract with the corrections department, sort of the side agreement, among all the parties was that they would just keep, every fiscal year, that they would re-up the contract. Well, so the fiscal year here in New Mexico for the state ends in at the end of June. And it was the last couple of days of May, I think it was, when I had submitted the report. So Roger Christ was the director of corrections at the time, and I get a phone call to come pay him a visit. So I went in, and I was informed that I was informed that I was that they were not going to renew my contract, in effect firing me. And so I said, well, okay. And I was really worried that would cause another uprising out at the prison. And so um, uh, I decided that what I was going to do was to hold a press conference. And of course, as soon as I called the press conference, um, the corrections department is wondering, what's this, what's he going to say? Because what I was going to do was to explain exactly what had happened, so that and I was going to make a plea for calm at the prison, and ask that that there not be an uprising. So that then created discussions between plaintiffs' counsel and defense counsel. And so before the press conference was going to happen, they agreed that my contract would be extended for another 6 months or 8 months, or it was 6 or 8 months. I don't remember. And so that's how all that happened. Now, um, so there were a couple of motions that got filed. Um,
You did finalize, you had sent this draft out. You did finalize that, is that right?
yeah, and
And
since
you know,
neither side had any substantive change, that they brought to my attention, the corrections department, all they did was complain. But they
did
did.
they let you continue to talk to their staff
Yeah, yeah.
in the next 6 or 8 months, even though they knew you'd be using that factually, or
Hmm.
maybe against them?
Yeah, yeah.
Dan, there's a almost limitless uh, number of things that we could talk about with respect to the riot and your involvement in it, and I think it's fascinating, and it also brings back some memories since I was around at that time as well. But
Yeah.
uh, but I'm going to take a detour here for just a second, and that is because I know that you've got a lot of other experiences you can tell us about that are not riot related. But one thing that is that people should know and probably do by now is that you're the recipient of the latest Driscoll Award from NMCDLA, and I want to congratulate you for that.
Thank
And
you.
just get your reaction. We're doing this on June the 6th, and you're going to get the award, I think, next week, I believe. And so just wanted to congratulate you on that and get your reaction.
Well, thank you. I am deeply honored by the recognition, and to be included with the prior recipients, which include you, is an honor that I will always cherish. And honestly, I've been overwhelmed by it. It's a wonderful experience.
Well, I'm glad you have that feeling, and you're certainly well deserving, and you deserve all the recognition. In part, as shown by our interview up to this point, because just your bright-eyed enthusiasm is really inspirational, and I don't know, it's not that normal, and it's very good to see that and hear that from you. So we're going to end this segment. We will continue to talk about your experiences in the next segment, and including the riot and other things, other aspects of your life. But for now, this will be this segment of True Believers and the Road to Hell.